Hey there Starks, Lannisters, and Targaryens. Welcome to Versus Series Shorts, where I take two characters and set them against each other in a trial by combat. Today, we will pit Khal Drogo, the Great Rider from the Dothraki Sea, against Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper of Dorne. For this video, I will be observing these characters as they appear in A Song of Ice and Fire, using the Game of Thrones television series mostly for visual reference. For Khal Drogo, this will be Book 1, Game of Thrones. For Oberyn Martell, this will be Book 3, A Storm of Swords. The first time we were introduced to Khal Drogo, he was described as a head taller than the tallest man in the room, yet he carried himself with the grace of a panther. This was all of course grouped with his broad physique and mounting strength, though I would consider his physical structure more in line with a LeBron James than a Warren Sapp. Not as stout as a football lineman, but more akin to the balanced brawn and agility of a basketball forward. Oberyn had a more standard build, never usually the tallest man in the room like Drogo, and often juxtaposed as a smaller man, relative to much bigger men, like Edgar Yornwood in The Mountain. Like Drogo's description, Martell was a light-footed fighter, but instead of pouncing with the power and dexterity of a panther, he slithered, like the Red Viper for which he was named, taking quick jabs and then coiling away. In a pure physical contest, this technique might not be as effective against Khal Drogo as it was against the Mountain. Though the books never detailed any of Drogo's fights, the lore does establish that he was undefeated.
When Dothraki are defeated in combat, they cut off their braid so the whole world can see their shame. Khal Drogo has never been defeated.
And the one fight we see of him in the TV series showcases the agility that likened him to a mountain cat. Though I feel this example is more of an outlier than a consistency, as Drogo was simply insulting Mago by forfeiting his weapons. Even still, physically, Drogo has the advantage for his strength. Oberyn's blitzing and retreat method is effective, but against one who is an equal, or at least a near equal, with regards to dexterity, his own leverage is less effective, and not so decisive. Khal Drogo gets the edge for his physical abilities. The Dothraki were a horseback culture, spread across the open plains and deserts of the Dothraki Sea. As such, their weapons and armor were designed to optimize both their climate environment and horseback tactics. For Drogo, his primary melee weapon was an arak, half sword and half scythe, a great cutting weapon with a curve that reduced drag, perfect when blitzing a village on horseback. The Dothraki also did not wear armor, as mobility was favored over protection, or as Rokharo would say to Jorah Mormont, this also carried over to Drogo, who certainly favored his ability to move and his ability to outpace his opponent, rather than bog himself down in plated armor. As described in A Storm of Swords, Prince Oberyn wore a light armor of greaves, vambraces, a goriette, a spalder, a steel codpiece with chainmail covered in supple leather and flowing silks, topped off with a half-helm. He too preferred the ability to move about, rather than covering himself head to foot in steel plating.
Looks like very light armor. I like to move around.
And like any good Dornishman, his primary melee weapon was an 8-foot spear. The benefit of such a weapon was his reach and nuanced movement, and despite novice belief, a spear didn't need to be thrust too deeply to be effective. Though most of the video game For Honor is fantasy and not historical. As an example, the mechanic of bleed damage is very good. A single successful cut from a spear, even a few inches into a body, can cause fatal injury, and Oberyn's spears were laced with poison for good measure. This was all coupled with his use of a small shield, also valued for its mobility and versatility. At first glance, it's rather clear that Oberyn's weaponry and armor are superior to Drogo's. But there are a few points that put the simplicity of Drogo's arak into contention. One is the structure of the weapon, which is highly curved. The obvious benefit is the cutting power, but it can also be used to subvert one's use of a shield, hooking around it to either disable an opponent's grip or to nick an unprotected hand. Also, Drogo's arak could break Oberyn's wooden spear shaft with a few proper slices. Despite this, these can be negated by Oberyn's armament. If Drogo is able to break Oberyn's spear and then undermine the protection of his shield, Oberyn is still protected by his vambraces. And if Drogo somehow lands a more decisive blow, it's unlikely his arak would do much damage to Oberyn's chainmail. The over-specialized curve of an Arak would also leave no room for thrusting, which is what Drogo would need to pierce between Oberyn's light plating. In any case, it's far more likely for the Dornish prince to take the advantage purely on the merits of his equipment. His spear gives him superior reach, his armor and shield give him superior protection, without sacrificing dexterity. Oftentimes, the point of Oberyn's spear was looking for chinks in the armor, and those targets would be far more favorable against Drogo's unprotected skin. Oberyn Martell gets the edge for his weapons and armor. Superior weaponry aside, you also have to know how to use your arsenal. As stated already, Drogo was an undefeated Khal. Granted, we have no context for how this happened. Was he only facing other Khals? Did he ever face against the Unsullied, like Khal Tema? What we do know is that he gathered 40,000 riders behind his back, a Khalasar that was unusually large. Alone, this accolade means nothing, but within Dothraki culture, strength is valued above all else, and Drogo would not have attained his position merely by way of an elaborate Game of Thrones. That all said, Drogo was far more likely a formidable fighter. Typically, a Dothraki fights with tenacity as a forethought, simply blitzing an opponent with kinetic strength, much as Kotho attempted against Jorah Mormont. Sidesteps and dodging would likely be Drogo's go-to tactic, and Dothraki seem to favor binding their opponent's blade with the down curve of their Arak, a style that favored those who could keep up the heat against their enemy, constantly undermining flanks and redirecting blade strokes. For Prince Oberyn Martell, he was a bit of a globetrotter, picking up martial arts from all over Westeros, from the southern tip of Dorne to the western reaches of Casterly Rock. And from Esseros, he learned from the water dancers of Braavos and the all-purpose techniques of the Second Sons, even going on to form his own company within the ranks. And within the scope of the TV show, Oberyn states that he has also practiced in the fighting pits in Slaver's Bay. All of this is impressive, and is the reason why Oberyn was able to defeat the infamous Gregor Clegane in their initial engagement, as Bronn would say to Tyrion about facing a man of Clegane's size.
Maybe I could take him. Dance around until he's so tired of hacking at me he dropped his sword. Get him off his feet somehow. But one misstep, and I'm dead.
Oberyn was able to achieve success through his practice technique. Instead of matching strength for strength, he parried and redirected. Instead of simply blitzing with speed, he took a more nuanced approach. Attack, bail, reset, and repeat, until he found a chink in his opponent's defenses. From the show, at first glance, it may seem that Oberyn's fighting style is simply Hollywood flourishing. His use of his spear is more akin to a wushu fighter than a Western knight. But this still makes sense in the context of the lore, as Oberyn's technique is influenced by so many parts of his known world, so it would manifest as something unorthodox and exotic. It's pretty clear that Oberyn's martial skill and tactics are not only more varied than Drogo's, but more refined and deliberate. They both have similar styles that favored speed, but Oberyn's skill was geared to face not only more and different opponents, but different scenarios in the context of one fight. And it's within reason that Oberyn's IQ for fighting is more astute than Drogo's. Oberyn Martell gets the edge for his martial skill and tactics. If circumstances align where Drogo and Oberyn met in a trial by combat, who would the gods favor? Let's set up this fight. Let's say it takes place in the fighting pits of Meereen. The following is a hypothetical explanation of the possible outcomes. At the start of the fight, Drogo would be at a disadvantage. Nothing in the lore suggests that he has faced an armored Dornishman, and he would have to adapt to the prince's additional protection. But the armies of the Unsullied were Drogo's southern neighbors, and he would be able to adjust to a Dornish spear, perhaps better than he would against a Westeros longsword. Still, in the early fight, it would likely be a shutout in favor of Oberyn. The prince would have too much reach on the Khal, and it would take time for Drogo to disable Oberyn's shield or break his spear. And that's assuming that he could do so at all, as Oberyn would not stand around idly while Drogo circles around him with the kinetic strikes of an Arak. If the fight continues, even if Drogo takes a few cuts from Oberyn's poison blade, he would make it his mission to rid Oberyn of his protective shield or his jabbing spear, hooking around the small shield or chopping at the spear's wooden shaft. Though there is an off chance of success, it's far more likely for Oberyn to avoid the Khal's attempts, and this might have been established in the lore. Like Oberyn Martell's choice of weapon, the Unsullied that faced Khal were equipped with only a spear and shield, and while they were outnumbered, they were able to beat the best of the Khals. I feel something similar would happen here, with Drogo giving his best effort, yet being ill-equipped for this particular engagement. If the fight goes beyond this point, any cuts Drogo would have certainly taken to his unprotected skin would take effect, either by way of the poison itself or his loss of blood. Though not backed up by the lore, I believe Khal will be able to fight through the effects of the poison much longer than a normal man, but it would greatly hamper his capabilities. In the late fight, it's more likely that his constant hacking at Oberyn's spear would crack the shaft, and Drogo might be able to sink the tip of his Arak into an exposed joint. But again, the likelihood of victory still falls to Oberyn, not just because Oberyn has superior weapons and armor. It was not as though a novice was putting the spear and shield to practice. This, of course, was a celebrated fighter who was extremely smart and extremely capable. Anytime Drogo might think he would have the advantage or break Oberyn's guard, the prince will have a trick, a subversion, the patience to wait for not only a good thrust, but the best thrust. Of all the scenarios, I see this fight likely ending in the early to mid-fight. Drogo has a physical edge, which can possibly push him into a late fight, but once Oberyn's superior weaponry and armor come into play, the edge falls to the Red Viper, and this is further solidified by his martial skill and tactics. Ultimately, Khal is a horseback fighter, not a stand-up fighter, and Oberyn will be too sharp in mind, in body, and equipment. And thus, after an 8-10 advantage, Oberyn Martell, the Prince of Dorne, the Red Viper, would be the most likely victor. Of course, this is all my opinion based on the lore of A Song of Ice and Fire. Do you agree that Oberyn would take a majority victory, or do you believe the Great Rider is the most likely victor? Let me know in the comments below, and of course, peace, love, and 7 blessings.